Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Nehru Center and Yashwantrao Chavan Center, with so much help from Purva Patil, has actually tried to do something very new and innovative. Because a city like Mumbai, which is such a vibrant city and truly an international city, there is very little space for the international dialogues here. And we have put a small group together. Where's Dr. Neeraj? Dr. Neeraj moved here. With his help and support, we have managed to reach our 7th month actually, it's really moving well. And a lot of very good dialogue, very interesting people have come here. And I think India's aspirational foreign policy, India is actually going through a real aspirational time. For the reason I feel that always is when I travel this length and breadth of this country, aspirations are seen everywhere. It's not just an elite thing that my children should get into IIT, IIM, do better, or go to international schools. But I feel that the bottom of the pyramid of this country has realized that education is the only way to get respectability, and equality will only come because the minute you have a good degree, then nobody asks you. It becomes like an aspirational story. Oh my God, आता जिल्हा परिषद मध्ये शिकला आणि आज एवढा मोठा झाला. So actually those are real success stories of India, and that really inspire other people. So the way the country is going through this inspiration, because I remember there was a time when you went to rural India, you saw girls not really coming out, dressing very differently. Today, if you see a girl anywhere in India, she is wearing a pair of jeans, she is wearing a t-shirt. The brands may vary, but the girls look the same. Thanks to Instagram, Reel, social media, everybody in the nook and corner of this country knows what's happening globally. As a matter of fact, I'll tell you a little story, since it's an international foreign policy issue. I found it really interesting. The story I'll never forget. I was in an area called Indapur in my constituency. And just as with the President of India, President of America was coming, President Obama was visiting India at that time. And I had some foreigners visiting my constituency, so I was taking them out and I said, hey, look, America varnale. So one child put his head up and said, oh, Obama. I'm like, I was shocked that in a village in Indapur, somebody knew who Obama was. And I made that child stand up and I said, who's Obama? He said, his country president. So I was like, okay, how do you know? So he says, I saw on TV yesterday. In Marathi, of course, the whole dialogue went. I said, okay, and I just joked about it. And I said, who's he coming with? So he said, coming with his wife. I said, what is his wife's name? And you won't believe it, he actually knew. And he said, Michelle Obama. And he said, you know, I'm waiting because I've seen them on TV. They come in their own plane, and when they walk down, they hold hands and come down. I'm like, I was really appalled by this, that how television really informs you. And there was a chief minister of Maharashtra that time. So I said, well, this is going really international thanks to the guests. It was almost like I was pleasing the guests who were visiting from America, that the kids knew everything about them. So I said, okay, who's the chief minister of Maharashtra? So they told me the name. And I said, so what's his wife's name? They said, we don't know. I said, you know Michelle Obama's name and you don't know Chief Minister of Maharashtra's name? They said, Tai te vimanatun utrun thodi ashe kade kartat. We don't know her name. We have never seen her. So it was, I mean, media has really changed people's lives. So people do realize that international, I mean, what foreign policy? Foreign policy was a very elite topic, which is not elite anymore. People do realize everywhere in India that when something happens internationally, today our economy is not as insulated as it used to be. If there is a war in Russia, it affects my life in anywhere in a village. So they are very, very aware. They don't know the nuances of it, but they do realize that there is something that you need to do right to improve border relations. What is our relationship internationally with America? So they are very concerned and they're eager to know. So I think this whole dialogue is all about that. And I had the fortune to actually work on the External Affairs Standing Committee for 5 years. And Jaishankar ji was the Secretary of External Affairs that time. So I worked very, very closely with him, and it helps me dearly now that he is our minister now, for the reason that we may have strong ideological differences on many, many issues. But clearly, Jaishankarji, I would like to put it on record, is one of the finest ministers that we have experienced, because he always is very helpful. I mean, we have challenges with him sometimes when he takes some stands. But I must say, the entire ministry does exceptional work through COVID. Whenever we've had challenges to bring our children back, it's been a ministry which pan-India, I mean, all their people all over the world. So I always like to put it on record that I really thank the External Affairs Ministry, all over the globe, literally, who are most helpful. When we tweet, within half an hour we get a reply. So we may have all these other challenges, but when it comes to India, I think we're all very sensitive and very aware that there are some topics we must speak. We may have differences on the way government is handling it, but when it comes to external affairs, I think whatever we decide within India, we must debate it very, very carefully. So actually this dialogue also has to be a little careful. We can be very critical, but the words that we use, I think we all have to be a little careful, because it's border issues, national issues and things like that, international issues. But Dr. Parimal, we are looking forward to hearing your perspective. I gave the very narrow perspective of aspirations of just healthcare, education, lifestyles and things. But I think when it comes to foreign policy, I think we are really aspirational. And I think the first thing we need to start is with our relationship with China. And I have very strong views. A lot of people think I'm juvenile about it, but I think we have to engage. Wars only leave widows. So going all this, jingoism, it all sounds wonderful in campaigns, but jingoisms don't solve border issues. So I think we're looking forward to hearing what you hear, learn more from you. Dr. Bhosle, thank you very much for making the time. And I would request you to start the dialogue. Thank you very much.
Good evening. Chair of today's program, Dr. Harshad, Honorable Member of Parliament, Supriya Taiji, organizers of this program, Yashwantrao Chauhan Center, and distinguished participants in today's dialogue. At the outset itself, let me express my thanks and gratitude to Yashwantrao Chauhan Center for inviting me for this talk, and also allowing me to speak on India's aspirational foreign policy. Some of us, or rather many of us, would get an impression that the word aspiration got inducted into the dictionary post-2014. That's certainly not true, but it is certainly true that it has got added to our vocabulary post-2014. Because now we are looking at many things from the aspirational perspective. What we have achieved so far and what we want to achieve in the near future and in the distant future. As Supriya Tai was explaining, that India really has become aspirational, and different segments, they have become aspirational. I would also like to share a small incident that has really opened or that has given a glimpse of how aspirational we have become. Some 12 years ago, I went to Wardha for some field work, and in the afternoon I was at the Wardha bus stand, and I noticed that suddenly around 12:31 up to 2:30, the bus stand was full of rural girls and boys who have converged in Wardha in the morning, attended their schools, junior college, senior college, and then all of them were going back to their villages. And they were literally in hundreds. The entire bus stand was full only of the students in uniform, without uniform, but the adolescent girls and boys who were there. That was not something that I could see in my childhood in Vidarbha or at other places or so. So that aspiration of getting education, achieving something in life, and transforming our lives, transforming lives of our family, it has now reached to the downtrodden. It has reached to the last family in India, last persons in India. And it is quite obvious that that is also getting reflected in different policies that India is adopting, trying to implement, and so as in India's foreign policy as well. However, I would like to state that India's foreign policy, it has been aspirational from the beginning itself. The aspirations might be little different earlier and little different now. But India's foreign policy has been extremely aspirational from the beginning. Now, if we look at the word aspiration, its dictionary meaning says that a strong desire to achieve something great or big. So a strong desire to achieve something big or something great. It has always been there in India's foreign policy from the beginning. And it is also a little ambiguous because it talks about something. So what is that something that India's foreign policy, it has been trying to achieve? What is it that we are trying to get through our foreign policy? Now, aspiration is something that is somewhere in between a set goal and a dream. Aspiration is not a dream. Aspiration is achievable, but you really need to put up a lot of efforts to achieve it. It is not a simple goal. It is beyond the goal that you can set in your life, that you can set for your country, that you can set for your department or so. That is achievable. But aspiration is something that is beyond that, but it is also not a daydream. So something achievable, but for which you really need to put up a lot of efforts. And if we look at what were our aspirations in the past, and if we compare it to the present, we could see a kind of continuity and lot of changes as well. When India became independent, the biggest aspiration in India's foreign policy was to adopt and implement, quote unquote, independent foreign policy. And for a country like India, that was a big desire, that was a big wish, it was a real aspiration to have independent foreign policy. A country would have a foreign policy, but to have an independent foreign policy. And that was in the context of a colonial rule of more than 100 years or so, wherein Indians were subject to foreign policy decisions. Indians were subject to plunge into global affairs at the wish of our colonial masters. So whether it was a opium war in China, or it was a Boer war in Africa, or the First World War or Second World War, India became party to these wars not because of its own wish, not because of its own interest, but because the colonial masters wanted it to be. And that was something that India was very firm upon avoiding after getting the independence. That our foreign policy should be independent and it should not be tied to the global players. It should not be tied to the erstwhile colonial masters, was a very strong wish. And recently we could see that quite often we are again talking about strategic independence in our foreign policy, strategic autonomy in our foreign policy. So we could imagine that today, after 75 years of independence, if we are still concerned about losing our independence, our autonomy in foreign policy, what could have been the situation 75 years ago? The threat of manipulation at the hands of colonial masters, great powers, was real. And India indeed handled it quite well. And India was able to establish and practice its own independent foreign policy. The word non-alignment emerged much afterwards, but when in 1947 an Afro-Asian conference was summoned by Nehru in Delhi in 1947, the thought process was to help India to adopt an independent foreign policy. And that was a very big aspiration that India had at that point of time. The second aspiration that we had was what I would call as 3 Ds. The first D was about decolonization, second about denuclearization, and third about development. And we have been partially successful in achieving these 3 Ds in our aspirational foreign policy. While we have been extremely successful and commendable, it was for India to pursue the goal of complete decolonization of the world that ultimately was achieved in mid-1970s, and certainly a credit must go to India for persistently taking up the issues of decolonization. And that was something that was a phenomenal for a foreign policy of a country like India, that it was going beyond its narrow interests and trying to liberate people all across the world. And it was not merely a wish, but there was a strategy behind it, a strategy that was successfully implemented. And as a result of that, India contributed immensely in decolonizing the world. However, in terms of achieving the other two Ds, India was only partially successful. On the issue of denuclearization, it was on behalf of India, it was because of India's insistence, the world signed nuclear non-proliferation treaty. But as it was not up to the mark, it was not as India wanted it to be, India did not become party to nuclear non-proliferation treaty. So nuclear non-proliferation treaty partially achieved nuclear non-proliferation, but it was not a step towards the denuclearization of the world. And thus that agenda in India's aspirations remained unfulfilled. And on the third D of development, India's foreign policy tried to see that its economic policy, its relations with external countries, they would be linked to India's internal needs. First, it was about fulfilling our agricultural needs, fulfilling our needs of getting food grains from other countries, and at the same time getting technology, advancements in sciences to successfully usher into the green revolution. It was all part of India's foreign policy, something that began in early 1950s and was achieved in mid-1960s. This agenda played a significant role in India's foreign policy in terms of getting foreign assistance for technology development, in terms of getting science, the knowledge know-how for agricultural revolution. Indian foreign policy persistently pursued these matters with great powers, and despite its independent foreign policy and non-alignment that was not liked by great powers of the time, they partially assisted and helped India in achieving self-sufficiency in agriculture, in food grains, and also to lay down industrial foundations, technological foundations of the country. And at least partially we were successful on embarking on the path of development in terms of achieving our national goals. The third aspiration that we had was about playing a global role for ensuring world peace. Again, this was in the context of the two world wars that world has seen. And the Indian leadership was extremely unhappy with the way great powers they have taken, they have forced the world population into two world wars, and that proved to be catastrophic for not only the countries those fought those wars or who were at the center of those wars, but for the entire world. And therefore, from 1945-46 itself, India was talking about perpetual peace, trying to establish institutions, promoting institutions, being part of the institutions that would help in terms of establishing peace across the world. And if we look at India's foreign policy from 1947, at least till 1962, India played quite a constructive role, whether it was the Korean War, whether it was the Suez War of 1956, whether it was decolonization issue of Indonesia, etc. India's role was active. It was not a neutral role. It was an active role. India had proposals to resolve the issues, and India's opinions were taken quite seriously. And thus, India indeed was playing a role in terms of establishing a world peace. In fact, it is interesting to know that during our freedom movement, when we were arguing for our freedom, that why we should get freedom. One, it was a moral issue that why we should be slave of someone. It was also a political issue that politically we are capable of governing ourselves. It was also an economic issue that colonization had deprived us, not only deprived us, but had extracted all our resources and wealth from our country. And therefore, to do away with all these injustices, we wanted to have our independence. But if we look at the discourses of the time, the tall national leaders were always talking about if India would become independent, India would play its role in global affairs. This issue was referred to and mentioned in the Constituent Assembly debates by many stalwarts on many occasions. Whether it was about adoption of India's national flag, whether it was adoption of Article 51, whether it was approving Nehru's policies vis-a-vis Western countries, wherein Nehru argued for being part of the Commonwealth, pursuing independent foreign policy, but at the same time being part of the Commonwealth Association. So these issues were very strongly debated, referred to, discussed in the Constituent Assembly. And there was an unanimity that India has a capacity to play a global role to establish world peace. The so-called world powers of the time, for 50 years, they were failing to establish world peace. And in that context, then, India was aspiring to play that role. However, after 1962, mostly because of India-China war, India retreated to some extent from the global stage, and India began to concentrate more in its neighborhood and on the internal issues. And it was this unfulfilled aspiration that today we could see is playing its role. It is re-emerging in India's foreign policy, that we want to play a global role, that we are destined to play a global role. We have the capacity, we do have the vision to establish global peace, world peace, and that is something that India's foreign policy, it is trying to do today. That if there is one important aspiration of India's foreign policy, then that is about playing a global role, playing a role to establish peace everywhere and then usher the world into an era of new development. Similarly, the issue agenda of development was also not completely fulfilled. And as a result of that, we could see now India is referring to becoming a developed country, transforming itself from a developing country to the developed country. So at the time of independence, our aspiration was to usher into an era of development. That we did. But at that time, our aspiration was not to become a developed country, because we had no wherewithal about it. But today, we do have wherewithal. Today, we do have the capacity to transform ourselves into a developed country. So while earlier we were a proud developing country, now we want to do away with the tag of a developing country and we want to be a developed country. And these are the two unfulfilled aspirations of India's foreign policy that we are carrying into the new era. We are carrying into the 21st century, that we want to be a global player and we want to be a developed country now. No more doing with the developing tag. That has now become an aspiration of millions of Indians. Similarly, on the issue of denuclearization, as India realized that it was being isolated by the world powers on the issue of denuclearization, India changed the track. India changed the track in 1974, as prior to that, the world powers, the nuclear countries and many other countries, they signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And there was immense pressure on India to be signatory to Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. India demonstrated its power. It was not only a technological power, but it was a diplomatic capacity as well to test the nuclear weapon and withstand pressures from the nuclear powers. That India did in 1974, and thus India's aspirations on denuclearization also changed because of the external factors, that the world was not listening to India. And in that context, then India thought that India must demonstrate its capacity. And after 1991, there was also a realization, or rather India wanted to show it to the world, that the nuclear powers, they were justifying their nuclear weapons in the name of Cold War. They were justifying their nuclear weapons in the name of bipolarity. However, Cold War, at least at that point of time, ended that. The Cold War it happened because of the collapse of the Soviet Union. So the ideological rivalry was no more there in the world. And therefore, from 1945, the justification that was given by United States, by other European countries, by Soviet Union, by China to acquire nuclear weapon, it no longer existed. However, still after 1991, these countries did not do anything to denuclearize the world. And at that point of time, then India also decided that now was the time for India to acquire nuclear weapons, and thus India became nuclear in 1998 with the, again, aspiration of creating its own space in the world. And then it was realized that nuclear weapons would testify India's resolve to be a global power, to be a world power, and to play a role in world affairs. Today, the biggest aspiration of India, which is being reflected in its foreign policy, is with regard to getting recognition from the world to be not only a world power, not only a power that can play a role in global affairs, but also a rich civilization with continuous history of 5,000 years and something that the world can replicate, something that the world can learn from also. And in that quest, India is taking many initiatives that are reflected in different policies in the foreign policy domain. So when we say that India is now eager to get a recognition from the world, that it is a civilization of 5,000 years, that it wants to be a global player, etc. So how is it that India is trying to achieve this particular aspiration? So first of all, India is developing its soft power. India is developing its wherewithal about impressing the world about Indian civilization, about Indian value system, and Indian philosophy that can also be helpful to the world. So the promotion of yoga is part of it, promotion of Indian value system is part of it, promotion of Indian philosophy is part of it, and through that India again is reasserting itself, a project that began in late 19th century with Swami Vivekananda and later on with many of the leaders of the national movement, that India is much rich civilization than that of the Western countries. That project India is taking ahead with new vigor in 21st century now, and this has now become a great aspiration for India. And another way to achieve this aspiration is that India is trying to be a leader in the solar energy sector. India is also trying to be a leader in arm export area, wherein till this point of time, India was importing arms, but now India's aspirations are to export the arms to other countries. India wants to be part of nuclear suppliers group. India also wants to be part of the United Nations Security Council on a permanent basis. That these are some of the indicators that would prove that India has achieved what it wants to achieve. If India would become an NSG member, if India would become UN Security Council permanent member, if India would become a leader in export of arms, if India would become a leader in export of solar technology, and if India's soft power is being acknowledged by the world, these would be the indicators that India's aspirations are on the path of fulfillment. However, I would like to state that there are very serious shortcomings which can be done away with, which can be addressed to, and there are very serious dilemmas in our foreign policy that would prevent India from achieving its aspirations. I will first come to the shortcomings in our foreign policy, and there are at least 3 shortcomings that we are not addressing. We can, but we are not doing it. The very first is that to implement a foreign policy, you need arms, you need foots, you need heads, you need eyes, you need brains, and that is there in India's foreign policy. However, if we look at the size of India's foreign policy, it is nowhere to match aspirations of a country like India. The size of Great Britain's foreign policy establishment is minimum 4 times bigger than that of India's foreign policy establishment. We simply cannot compare it with China or United States or even with France and Russia. Their foreign policy establishments are much bigger than that of ours. Great Britain alone are having diplomats or officials who are serving in their foreign ministry up to 8,000 to 9,000, where we are still below 3,000 or so. Unless we increase our capacity in terms of human resources in our external affairs ministry and other wings that are important to implement foreign policy, we are not going to achieve our aspirations. Few years back, Shashi Tharoor floated a proposal that Indian Foreign Service should be separated from Indian Administrative Service or from the UPSC General Examination. It was a wonderful proposal. Nothing has been happened on that so far. But I think that time now has come that we must separate Indian Foreign Service and we must have dedicated people who are interested in international relations, foreign policy, world affairs, etc., who are really willing to contribute in achieving India's aspirations also. The second problem or second shortcoming in India's aspirations is that we lack world-class universities, we lack world-class research centers, we do not have independent think tanks. The think tanks in India, more or less, either they are under government influence or they are under influence of foreign donors or foreign funders. We do not have independent think tanks. And unless these independent think tanks, on a very rigorous basis, they would provide feedback, they would analyze government policies, we are really not going to achieve everything in our foreign policy. Similarly, we also do not have world-class media. Media has expanded in India, but we do not have a single media house that we could say is world-class. We do not have our CNN, we do not have our BBC, we do not have our Al Jazeera. And unless we have it, we are not going to achieve our goals in foreign policy. And it is here that we are having a misperception about soft power of the country. We have this misconception that only Bollywood and yoga, they constitute the soft power. They do, but they are not sufficient to be the soft power. It is the intellectual prowess of the country, it is the universities, think tanks, research centers, your media that can influence not only your people, but that can influence people across the globe. That is your soft power. And this is a serious shortcoming in our foreign policy. The third shortcoming is that over the years, particularly under current regime, our foreign policy has become too much populist. Whatever we are doing in our foreign policy is to sell it to our people. That has become our top priority. Earlier, this was not the case. Earlier, the leaders would prepare the case and they would argue the case with the people of India and would try to convince them. Nehru was best example of it, wherein he would convince the entire country on the issue of denuclearization. He would convince the entire country on the issue of Indus Water Treaty with Pakistan. The public opinion might not be with the government, but government would have its own opinion about what is best in the national interest and would not do everything only to cater to the voters also. What is happening currently is that we are too much conscious of what voters would say, and we do not have the guts to tell truth to the voters that what is in our national interest in the long term. So we are basically playing to the sentiments and gallery of the people, which is not good for foreign policy of any country. So these are three shortcomings that we are currently having in our foreign policy, which would prevent us from achieving our aspirations. And along with that, there are at least two serious dilemmas and one what I would call as a division in our country that would prevent us from achieving our aspirations. These two dilemmas are, the first one is on the issue of globalization. So far, we have been party to globalization, but we were not leaders of globalization. And therefore, our position on globalization was sometimes we were willing party to globalization and sometimes we have lots of apprehensions on globalization. Now the situation has changed. Now there is no leader of globalization. Countries who were leading globalization, they themselves have become apprehensive about globalization. And therefore, while earlier countries like India were taking position on globalization vis-a-vis policies of these developed countries, United States, European countries, etc., now those countries themselves have become apprehensive on globalization. And therefore, we now cannot have this position that globalization is going, that we will be willing or half-hearted, unwilling or half-hearted partner in the journey of globalization. So either we have to take a firm position against globalization or we have to champion globalization, something that China is doing now. And we are still hesitating in doing that. That's a very serious dilemma that we are having. It got reflected in we not signing the RCEP. I'm not going into merits and demerits of RCEP. But if we are championing globalization, we cannot stay away from arrangements like RCEP. And if we do not want to be part of RCEP, we cannot champion globalization. So this is a dilemma that we have not been able to resolve. Rather, I would say we have not tried to resolve this particular dilemma in our foreign policy. The second dilemma is much more serious, and that is with regard to our neighborhood. And in neighborhood, again, there are three elements. The first one is our neighborhood minus Pakistan minus China. And dilemma with regard to this neighborhood, minus China, minus Pakistan, is how do we want to treat them? How do we want to position ourselves vis-a-vis these smaller neighboring countries? So for a larger part, we inherited a legacy of British Raj, wherein under British arrangement, we were the bigger partner, and they were smaller partner, and were basically telling the British India in South Asia or so. Now, over the years, these countries, they have also developed their own aspirations. And we still have not decided that how we should treat them. And therefore, our policy, it has been vacillating between treating them at par, at equal, and becoming hegemon in South Asia. We have not been able to resolve this particular dilemma so far. This dilemma was there at the time of Indira Gandhi, it was there at the time of Rajiv Gandhi, and it is very much there at the time of Prime Ministership of Narendra Modi as well. The second issue with regard to neighborhood is the question of Pakistan, that how do we want to tackle Pakistan? And what's happening regarding Pakistan is that we do not have a consistent policy vis-a-vis Pakistan, and our policy vis-a-vis Pakistan changes whenever position of Prime Minister also gets changed. So every Prime Minister is trying to reinvent the wheel vis-a-vis Pakistan, and every Prime Minister is then falling back on not talking to Pakistan. So this is something that we have not been able to address seriously. So what Rajiv Gandhi did, what Narasimha Rao did, what Atal Bihari Vajpayee did, what Manmohan Singh did, and what Narendra Modi did, it's same. We will talk to Pakistan, we will not talk to Pakistan. We will talk to Pakistan, we will not talk to Pakistan. We are not moving ahead in deciding our policy vis-a-vis Pakistan. And that is something that is pulling down us in international relations. And the third issue vis-a-vis neighborhood is, of course, what Supriyatai was also referring to, was the issue of China. Now, regarding China, we face two serious dilemmas. The first dilemma is that if we have to tackle China, if we have to handle China, whether to enter into anti-China alliance or not. Now, there is a strong opinion in India. Government is not in favor of it. Whichever party's government, that is not in favor of it. But if you look at discourses in various think tanks, if you look at discourses in English media, many are arguing for that. It is because of Indian government's insistence, Quad has not become a military alliance. Otherwise, US wants it to be a military alliance, Japan, Australia, all of them, they want it to be a military alliance, and many within Indian foreign policy establishment and think tanks, they want it to be a military alliance, but Indian government is very firm that it should not be a military alliance, whether it was Manmohan Singh's government or Narendra Modi's government. So that is a one question that is going to face us, that how we are going to tackle China, whether to be part of anti-China alliance or whether to have our own ways of tackling China. And the second issue regarding China is that for long, from 1991 till 2020, almost for 30 years, both of us, India and China, we were batting for multipolar world order. Now we are no longer batting, we are no longer arguing for multipolar world order, because there is a realization that this multipolar world order also would be a hierarchical one, wherein US would be on the top, China would be catching up with the US, and then there would be huge disparity between US, China on the one hand, and the other aspiring powers, other great powers in the world. India certainly would be in the league at third or fourth number, but the distance between China as a pole and India as a pole, it will be very big. And therefore, we are now not talking about multipolar world. And therefore, there is no clarity that what type of world we want to achieve. And that is a serious dilemma that we are facing vis-a-vis our neighborhood, Pakistan and China. And the third and last issue regarding achieving our aspirations is, I would not call it as a dilemma, but it is a division that has happened in our society. And the division is on the line of whether we want to be like the world or whether we want the world to be like us. आपल्याला जगाला आपल्यासारखं बनवायचं आहे की आपण जगासारखे बनणार आहोत. This is a serious division that is there. When we began our journey in 1947, we wanted the world to be like us, believing in the principle of democracy, inclusivity, secularism, social justice, development, etc. Today is the most ripe time for India to showcase Indian secularism, Indian inclusivity, and Indian democracy to the world. On all these counts, on secularism, democracy, and inclusivity, so-called founders of democracy in the world, they are faltering. United States is faltering, and all the European countries are faltering, including France, where the French Revolution had taken place, giving the slogan of liberty, equality, and fraternity or so. But we, from 1947 onwards, practiced these principles in a distinct way, in an Indian way. And today we can show to the world that this is the way how you should practice these principles. However, what is happening or what has happened is that now we want to be like a Turkey, we want to be like Erdogan's Turkey, or we want to be like China, we want to be like Xi Jinping's China, or we want to be like Donald Trump's America. Not America, but Donald Trump's America or so. And that is something that is not taking India's foreign policy and India ahead in international relations and in the global affairs. So these are the serious dilemmas and divisions that we are facing in achieving aspirations in our foreign policy. And regarding this, why it is not being addressed is simply because we do not have a culture of political dialogue in our country. We have vibrant democracy, we have vibrant political party system, but we still lack the culture of political dialogue in our country. Last time we seriously debated and discussed foreign policy issues on the national scale was, I think it was the nuclear deal with United States. And since then, we are evading a national debate on concrete issues, which is not good, which is not healthy for a democracy and for an aspiring country like India. We do not have debate and dialogue on how to resolve the Kashmir issue. We do not have debate and dialogue on the issue of how to resolve a border dispute with China. There is no unanimity. We do not know exactly what is our solution. Even if we want to engage China and even if we want to resolve the border dispute, we do not know what ultimately we want to achieve. Because this has never been told to us by any establishment, by any government, even by any political party, that this is the solution that we are proposing to resolve India-China border dispute, or this is the solution that we are proposing to resolve the Kashmir dispute or so. And it is this lack of political dialogue that also will be proven costly for us to achieve our aspirations. And in this overall context, I certainly would like to say that the kind of initiative that Yashwantrao Chauhan Center has taken in starting this dialogue, Mumbai dialogue, what we require is hundreds of Mumbai dialogues within Mumbai and outside Mumbai, across the country also. Unless and until all our cities and towns, they would be discussing these issues, we would really not be able to really work on our aspirations. They remain our dreams, but not our aspirations. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir, for that really thorough insight into India's foreign policy. I would now like to invite Dr. Bhosle to give his presidential address.
Thank you very much.
Sir, you want to talk from here?
Be more comfortable here.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you very much. It was insightful lecture, and it was a pleasure to listen to Parimal. As usually, he normally theorizes several contemporary circumstances and contextualize his argument within a particular theory. There are very few scholars in India who actually theorize or try to theorize contemporary development within a particular context. And he is one of the theorists of international relation who actually observes circumstances in and around our society, who observes relations between different countries and try to contextualize it. I fully agree with his major argument, and now the floor is open for discussion, debate. Anyone who wishes to ask question or who would like to have clarity, they can ask questions. Okay. Foreign policy actually is a very dynamic process, and foreign policy is always framed on basis of certain circumstances. And these circumstances actually makes a country to develop its own foreign policy. Foreign policy is influenced by its historical context. Foreign policy is influenced by its cultural dynamics. Foreign policy is always influenced by its ancient antecedents. And foreign policy is actually lies in its doctrinal root of a country. All these things comes together and foreign policy is framed, and India is no exception to this. When India frames its foreign policy, that period was very dynamic. When India framed its foreign policy, that period actually was a politically turbulent period because 3 to 4 streams were moving ahead at the same time. Anti-colonialism or movement against colonization, movement against imperialism, there were national movement, and all these, and the most important part was construction and framing of our constitution. So all 3 to 4 dynamic movements were happening at the same time, and all these things, if you combine these things together, we come to know that our foreign policy actually is connected with all these things. Framing of a foreign policy cannot be looked in a very, very separate and very isolated way, but foreign policy is always influenced by all these things. And when India framed its foreign policy, it was actually an amalgamation of several ideas and ideologies. And most probably this is one of the best example and the only example in this world where foreign policy is framed on basis of idealistic principles, and we have successfully imbibed those idealistic principles for several years. Because we were influenced by a principle of anti-imperialism, because we had a very bad experience, anti-colonialism, and therefore some kind of idealistic construction was the edifice of our foreign policy. And that was a very special achievement of India. And India was, in fact, India's efforts were appreciated at international level. This continued for several years, and as I have already mentioned, that foreign policy is always influenced by certain circumstances, as he has rightly pointed out. In 60s and 70s, certain circumstances emerged, and in consonance with the changing dynamics of those circumstances, India a little bit changed its foreign policy and adopted certain realistic principles. It advanced for 20, 30 years, and now we are in 21st century. The reality and the circumstances have changed after COVID pandemic. And COVID pandemic has, in fact, informed all of us that the nation states, the nature of their acting, the nature of their performance, if you observe them keenly, we could easily notice that the nations, they are interested in studying the future catastrophic situation. What catastrophic situation will arise tomorrow? They are interested in studying what are the dangers, what are the risks, what are the opportunities, and what are the challenges before them. And many countries are interested in resolving those issues, not only resolving these issues, but also they are trying to seek what are our opportunities. Taking this particular fact into consideration, many nation states, they are trying to portray themselves as resilient to international happening, resilient to international conflicts, and resilient to all type of international economic forces and globalized forces. Because they are interested in developing some kind of interdependence, they want to develop some kind of military relationship. So second and the most important part of this particular changing scenario is that several countries have adopted a democratic model. In fact, the most autocratic nation will also call itself as a democracy, because democracy has now become a very popular buzzword. Even Taliban themselves, they sometimes criticized the war between Ukraine and Russia and claimed that there should be some kind of peaceful resolution. So the trend of democratization and we love democracy has spread all over the world, and this was significantly highlighted after several color revolutions. after 80s and 90s, and especially after disintegration of Russia, we have seen several color revolutions, several symbolic revolutions where power transition has taken place without a bloodshed. And at that time, the democratic system has got some kind of legitimacy. So within this democratic model, the nation states are interested in stabilizing, not only stabilizing, but adjusting their foreign policy. And they are basically taking into consideration what rhetoric the popular people are expecting. Rhetoric is taken into consideration, and rhetoric has become part and parcel of foreign policy of different countries, and India is no exception to this. So he has very, very importantly and rightly pointed out. So the condition has changed. Several countries, they are becoming more and more resilient, and several countries they want to portray that they are more stabilized. And in this kind of portraying, the brand building process has already started. So now the nomenclature of powerful or being powerful is not decided by how military stockpile you have, but how is your economic condition. Because earlier, when we were talking about superpower rivalry, bipolarity, unipolar system, multipolar system, now there are theorists, now there are thinkers who say that there is no polarization or there is no polarity. Richard Haas, for example, has forwarded one dictum, and that dictum is very important. According to him, there is no polarization. This is non-polar world. And if this is non-polar world, the relations between the countries are dictated by global capitalist powers, financial institutions, and World Trade Organization's rules or regulations. So if this is the reality, then we have to change. Different countries are changing. India will have to change. And if India still stuck to its rudimentary kind of strategy, then definitely India is going to face certain hurdles. It is in this particular background, this lecture is very important, because he has not given just a kind of certain scratch speeches, pieces about some informative ideas, but he has actually built a very important theory. And on that particular theory, the entire lecture is constructed. And this is, in fact, very, very important, what we can say, characterization of this particular speech. So I congratulate him, because the speech actually, if you describe the nature of speech, it was actually based on some kind of comparative analysis. It had some kind of dialectics, and it was, in fact, based on some individual rational impressions, and that was instrumental in nature. So rational instrumentality was the base of his entire lecture. And there are very few scholars who actually try to construct this type of intellectual discourse. And I'm very happy that he has come out with some independent findings. And his independent finding, his own independent research has now been open for discussion. I thank for his very, very engagedful, very meaningful, and very entrenched kind of discussion. And now the entire discussion is open for clarification, and some of you can intervene, some of you can comment, and if you feel you can ask questions. The house is open for meaningful, reasonable discussion. So you're comfortable here, or you'd like?
You can just raise your hand and we'll have the mic to you.
It was very interesting explanation, and it was very impressive. I want to ask you one thing about secularism. In our country, do you think that secularism is in danger? And how it is going to affect if it is, then how it will affect our foreign policy?
Thank you, sir. I do consider that secularism is on the back foot in our country, and there is a very strong current for majoritarianism in our country. That democracy is being interpreted as majoritarianism, which is not democracy, and therefore the fundamentals on which our country was founded. So somewhere those fundamentals are being shaken at this point of time. But that's a different part of it. In terms of foreign policy, first let us take a look at what is happening across the world. The concept of secularism as it emerged in Europe, it was in a particular context of a conflict between Protestants and Catholics and a separation of state and church. It was not in the context of a multi-religious society, multi-ethnic, multi-linguistic society. And that's where Indian secularism, it differed from European secularism or Western secularism. Now those countries, they have also become multi-ethnic, multi-religious to some extent. And they are now seriously facing this problem, that how to adopt people who are not of our race, who are not of our color, who are not of our religion, who are not, who do not have faith in our God. That conflict is very visible. From United States to Australia, we can see this conflict arising in those democratic and secular countries also. It is here that India actually can make a very meaningful intervention and can convince the world about inclusivity and tolerance. Just take an example that the turbans were banned in France. India had taken up that issue. But if we do not follow it in our own country, it would become difficult for us to pursue freedom, to pursue freedom of expression for Indians of any faith in other countries also. So it is what I said in the end, whether we want the world to be like us or we want to be like them. It is there that ultimately, in my opinion, the ultimate objective of foreign policy is to convert the world like us. That's what Soviet Union attempted to do. That's what United States is trying to do. And that's what we should also try to do. But for that, we also need to first firm up what we are and what is it that we want to project in the world.
My yes, can I ask?
Yeah. Yes.
My question is regarding that there is this dominant theme in foreign policy that we learn in our courses about non-alignment. And the buzzword now is multi-alignment. So is non-alignment really a relevant movement right now? Are we pursuing this in principle, or we have shifted towards multi-alignment? And is there a justification for multi-alignment in the present context? Yeah. Thank you.
For me, non-alignment was it is as relevant as it was in the past. What was non-alignment? Let us first come to the fundamentals of non-alignment. Non-alignment was not aligning with any of the military blocs. Whether there would be 2 military blocs in the world or only 1 military bloc in the world in the form of NATO, or there would be multiple military blocs. We will not align with any military bloc. And therefore, even after 1991, after collapse of Soviet Union, non-alignment was relevant for India. And till this point of time, all the governments, they have followed non-alignment. They have categorically rejected proposals of being overtly military allies of any country, particularly that of the United States. So in my opinion, non-alignment certainly is relevant. Multi-alignment, for me, it is just playing of the worlds, nothing more than that. It is balancing in this uncertain world. That also we are trying to do quite smartly. Our position on Ukraine war, it is a best example of non-alignment as well as multi-alignment as well. So we are aligning with Russia, we are also aligning with European countries and United States and maintaining our non-alignment position. So this is something that has been proven time and again, that non-alignment is not merely an ideological construct, but it is in India's national interest. Given India's position, given India's geographical location, it is in India's national interest to pursue non-alignment in its foreign policy.
Yes, I am asking. Thank you. May I? Thank you very much, sir, for that very comprehensive and extremely excellent presentation. And I think we need to get more into the depth of what you have been saying. You know, my question is in relation to the political dialogue that you mentioned, you know, which is absent and which the presence of which becomes very important, and the interconnection between the secular approaches and understanding, which are now bothering, which have become a problem for foreign countries, and how they have to look up to us, because really we have a legacy behind us. The Indian civilization legacy behind us is absolutely invaluable. But you see, my question here is that because in every debate that we are looking at today, religious and, non-secular approaches are getting stronger. My question is, do you think that we could eliminate or remove this from the public discourse of political dialogue and concentrate on the issues of development, of growth, of scientific temper, and something that will take India ahead? That is my question. Thank you.
I think many of us, they are trying to engage with this particular issue, how to overcome the divisive discourses in our society and try to concentrate on the real issues also. But in my opinion, we have seen a regime change. It's not only regarding a change of the government, but in terms of a change in society's thinking per se. And it will take a while for us to fight back and re-establish rationality, re-establish inclusivity and democratic principles in our country, and to focus on people's real needs also. What has happened in Indian context is, to a great extent, corporatism and irrationality, they have joined the hands. And it is the corporate power that is somehow not resisting irrationality and unscientific temper. Something that is different from Western countries also, or at least at the time of their Renaissance, Industrial Revolution, their democratic upsurge, etc. The elite in those countries, the industrial class in those countries, they stood by rationality, they stood by science. That is something that we do not see happening in India. Very disturbingly, just last week, I have come across in a discussion with a group that I didn't know this, but I came across that not only in United States, but even in India, groups are emerging who are advocating that Earth is flat. So we are going back to 16th, 17th century. Darwin has been removed from NCERT textbooks. So these are the things that are highly disturbing, and that also shows that it's not this is not a political battle. This is not at all just a political battle. It is just a part of it. But this is a much larger battle, something that we have not analyzed completely. That why it is happening. It is happening across the world, but in India also it is happening. So why exactly it is happening? Which are the forces who are promoting it, etc. I think we should first do a concrete analysis of it, and we have not done it so far also. Without that, we won't be able to fight these forces.
Yeah, Sagar would like to ask a question. Sagar.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. There is this reassertion of decolonization thinking among African and Caribbean scholars. Regarding that, as you said, India changed this position of becoming anchor of this decolonized country after 1962. So right now, India's position to emerge as a global player. So is it aligned with this ideal principle of reassertion of decolonization, decolonizing global institutions, or there might be some kind of possible conflict from the side of India as becoming as a big power for those third world nations?
It's a very, very good question indeed. At this point of time, there is no conflict. But if we emerge as an economic powerhouse in the world, the conflict would certainly emerge. This is what China is trying to avoid, but they are not being able to avoid it. So the process of colonialism itself is linked to your economic development, stage of your economic development. So the European countries, they became colonial powers because of particular stage of their economic development. Now that's what is apprehension about China. The level of economic development China has achieved. Now unless they invest it in other countries, unless they don't try to seek returns from those investment, their economy itself would not sustain. And that is something that could be applicable to India in the future, but not at this point of time. So your question is quite relevant academically, that whether we have been able to find out an economic model of development that ultimately would not turn up into being a colonial power. That's an academic challenge that is there before the world. I think we have not. We have not gone very seriously into finding out that particular model.
Yes, questions? Oh, yeah.
Hello, sir. Sir, you mentioned about regional comprehensive economic partnership. So what do you think that means? It was a good decision to not joining the RCEP, and you also said about we cannot championing the globalization because of that. So can you throw some light on this? Thank you.
So today, RCEP, it has emerged as the biggest economic free zone or economic partnership. And India was party to RCEP from the beginning, throughout the negotiations also. And it was only at the last stage, India decided not to join it. So my point is that we have taken these decisions without proper discourses within. In fact, before Prime Minister's announcement that we will not be joining RCEP, just 2 days before that, Piyush Goyal has given a statement that we are going to join RCEP. So there was no clarity about it, that why we were throughout in the process. And then if we have decided not to join it, and in my opinion it was a wise decision not to join it hurriedly, because the dairy farmers in India particularly would be at the receiving end. So the two things emerge here. One, didn't we have the diplomatic capacity to convince other countries about how we want the RCEP to be? Certainly we did not. We did not become successful in that, and therefore we had no option but to withdraw. Secondly, negotiations on RCEP were going on for at least for 6-7 years, very seriously. Now, in this intervening period, what is it or what was it that we did to strengthen the sectors like agriculture, dairy farming, etc., that would not be at the receiving end if India would join that particular sector? So when you go for such ventures, you have to obviously take care of your constituencies that are often being neglected. Now, why again this is happening? Because we do not have trained manpower for that. So we do not have those capacities which government can employ to think in multi directions, that what can be done and what should be done and what should be avoided also.
Thank you, sir. I'm Sarvesh Lokre from Mumbai University. I would like to ask, is there any criteria to be a part of UNSC, as there are only 5 permanent members? And second is, does India need more socio-economic political alliances? Because we see some SAARC and BRICS somewhere lack about it. So do we need that? Thank you.
Okay. Regarding UNSC criteria, basically the only criteria is that you have to destruct the world, and then you need to try to see that you are going to construct the world now. So who became UNSC permanent members? The victorious powers of the Second World War. So the world was almost destructed, or at least the world order was destructed by Second World War. And then the victorious parties, they laid their claim and they became permanent members of Security Council. And therefore this is something that we are not going to get very easily. Okay, unless there is going to be a complete collapse, either a collapse of security order or collapse of economic order. It's not very easy for India to get a permanent membership. One way of looking at it is that after a while, UN itself would become completely defunct. and then a new world organization would emerge, in the construction of which India can play a leading role, as India played a leading role in construction of G20. So in construction of another global organization, India can play a role, and UN itself would become redundant because of the changed dynamics also. Now let me share one interesting, not so much interesting, but something that when I was in JNU, that time this debate was there at the beginning of the 21st century as well, that when will India get permanent membership of United Nations Security Council, and whatever we would be listening from our professors and all. So in one of the, it was a political meeting, I made a statement that for another 25 years we are not going to get permanent membership of United Nations Security Council. That was 2001. Now we are just 2-3 years away from fulfilling 25 years and try and to see whether we will get it or not. But I was wrong. That it's not 25 years, but I should have said 50 years. We are not going to get permanent membership of United Nations Security Council. It is about the world order. So world order would decide who would be there at the driving seat.
नमस्कार सर, पत्रकार मंगेश फदाले. तुम्ही खूप कमी वेळेमध्ये खूप चांगल्या आणि महत्त्वाच्या मुद्द्यांना हात घातला आणि खूप सोप्या पद्धतीने समजावून सांगितलं. त्यातलं आवडलेले 3-4 मुद्दे सांगतो आणि एक प्रश्न विचार. 3D तुम्ही बोललात ते, नंतर थिंक टँक आपल्याकडे नाही आहेत किंवा जे आहेत त्यांना फॉरेन फंडिंग आहे अशा संस्थांच्या अखत्यारीत आहेत, ती खरं तर शोकांतिका. आणि वी डोंट हॅव BBC, आपलं BBC, CNN किंवा अल जझीरा सारखे जगमान्य असे युनिव्हर्सल मीडिया ब्रँड्स भारताकडे नाही आहेत. ते पण खूप बॅकफूटला आणणाऱ्या गोष्ट. म्हणजे भारतीय उद्योगपतींनी किंवा कुठल्या गुंतवणूकदारांनी तसा अद्याप स्वातंत्र्याच्या 75 वर्षांमध्ये विचार नाही केला की जो आपला इंडियन मीडिया ब्रँड जगभर फॉलो करतील, जसं आपण BBC आणि CNN फॉलो करतो. आणि डोळ्यात झणझणीत अंजन घालणारं तुम्ही बोललात की बॉलिवूड किंवा योगाच फक्त आपली भारताची ओळख असू नये, त्या व्यतिरिक्त आपल्याकडे भरपूर काय आहे. आणि व्हायब्रंट पॉलिटिकल डायलॉग नाही ते तर आपण बघतोयच आहे. मागच्या 7-8 वर्षात ती आचारसंहिता खूप खालावलेली आहे. आणि एवढं बोलून तुम्हाला एक प्रश्न विचारावा वाटतो. भारतीयांना संभ्रमण टाकणाऱ्या घटना घडल्या. म्हणजे पाकिस्तानच्या बाबतीत आपली काही फिक्स निश्चित अशी फॉरेन पॉलिसी नसल्यामुळे म्हणजे आपलेच पंतप्रधान निगेटिव्ह वातावरणामध्ये मध्येच जाऊन तिकडे केक आणि बिर्याणी खाऊन येतात आणि रशियाला सल्ला देतात की हे काही युद्धाचं युग नाही आहे. तर मग त्याच वेळेला भारत आणि चीनच्या बॉर्डरला रॉडनी हाणामारी चालू असते आणि तिथं आपले जवान जखमी होतात. अशा अनेक घटना घडल्या असतील. ही एक किंवा अशा काही घटना, खूप क्वचित घटना त्या आपल्या लोकांसमोर, आपल्यासमोर आल्या, भारतीयांसमोर. तर तुम्हाला असं वाटतं का की ही जी अनिश्चित असलेली पाकिस्तानसोबतची किंवा चायनासोबतची फॉरेन पॉलिसी ही आपल्याला घातक ठरू शकते महासत्ता बनण्यासाठी? आणि ह्यावरती जर तुम्ही थोडा प्रकाश झोत टाकला तर आनंद वाटेल, महत्त्वाची माहिती मिळेल.
नक्कीच. आधी चीनवरती येतो की चीनबाबत आपल्याला आधी तर 2 बाबतीत आपल्याला मत बनवावं लागेल. एक, सध्याची चीनची स्थिती काय आहे, म्हणजे चीनमध्ये खूप स्फोटक स्थिती आहे का, चीनची अर्थव्यवस्था नष्ट होणार आहे का, रसातळाला जाणार आहे का, चीन पुढच्या 20-25 वर्षांमध्ये नेमका कुठे असेल, या बाबतीमध्ये आपल्याला फार स्पष्ट मत बनवावं लागेल. दुसरं, चीनच्या तुलनेमध्ये आपण कुठे आहोत हेही आपल्याला आपलं मत बनवावं लागेल, बेस्ड ऑन फॅक्ट्स, बेस्ड ऑन डाटा. Unless we do that, unless we realize that we are lagging behind China, we are not going to catch up with China. So the first thing that is required is to realize where exactly we are lagging behind. Now trade is one area that we all know that it is extremely tilted towards, the trade relations are tilted towards China. Okay, so likewise, then what all are the areas where we are lagging behind China and why so? Why so? A very obvious answer is that China's economic base is many times, it's bigger than India now. That is a fact. Chinese economy is not shrinking. Chinese economic growth rate is declining. Growth rate is declining because they have experienced unprecedented growth rate for almost 4 decades. That was unprecedented in world history. Now, no country can have 8%, 9%, 10% growth rate continuously for 40, 50 years. So it was very obvious that Chinese growth rate would decline. That is declining now. But during this period, the foundations of, or the pie of Chinese economy, it has been expanded to such a large extent that even if their economic growth rate would be half than that of India's economic growth rate, actually their economy would grow bigger than India's economy. So we have to acknowledge this fact first and then decide what is to be done regarding it. So unless we do that, and I completely agree that we have no option but to engage with China. So how exactly we engage it, whether we engage it blindly or whether we engage it cautiously, that is something that we need to really decide. In my opinion, last 2-3 years we have become quite cautious about engaging with China. However, this cautious approach is leading to lack of political dialogue between India and China. That is not good. That is not good for, particularly for India at this point of time. So there is a need to start a political dialogue, to start a dialogue at the highest political level between India and China. Now, what is the obstacle in doing that? The obstacle in doing that is that you have projected too much on a particular image of the government or image of the Prime Minister. Now, if Prime Minister would engage with China at this critical point, it would hamper that particular image. And therefore, we are not politically engaging China at this point of time. So this is something that we also try to see how we can de-link these aspects from our democratic politics and from what is the national interest, what is in the national interest also. But you are certainly right that if we don't address China problem, if we don't address how we tackle China in our periphery, in our neighborhood, something that Indra Kumar Gujral talked about in mid-90s, and most of us ridiculed him. We ridiculed the Gujral doctrine. But Gujral doctrine actually was implemented by China afterwards. Without expecting reciprocity, they have started investing a lot in India's neighborhood. So that was the Gujral doctrine, that don't expect reciprocity from your smaller neighbors. Okay, give largesse, have large heart, give largesse to them, and keep them healthy and happy. That was the approach. To some extent, China implemented it, we neglected it also. Now we have to give competition to China in our neighborhood. Something that was not there prior to 1990s. This is entirely a new scenario for India now also. So many challenges have certainly emerged. Now coming to Pakistan, again the question is what is it that we want to do with Pakistan? And how is it that we want, how do we see ultimate resolution of the Kashmir dispute, Kashmir problem also? That I think we do not have clarity on that. Even the ruling party in our country currently do not have a complete clarity on that. Going by policies of this government, I could see that the logical culmination, conclusion of this government's Kashmir policy would be accepting LOC as a international border. That only and only that could be the logical conclusion. That could be a solution to Kashmir problem. But then let's talk about it openly. At least in the academic circle, let's talk about it, whether that can be a solution to it or not. And on the question of Pakistan also, whether we are going to accept Pakistan as a, or whether it is in our benefit that Pakistan should be stable and prosperous, whether democratic or undemocratic, but it should be stable and prosperous, whether it is in India's interest or not. There is a thought process in India, and there is certainly a strong merit in that if Pakistan would become prosperous, Pakistan would use its prosperity to strengthen its case on the Kashmir issue and to use its prosperity or use the instruments against India, creating troubles for India. And I do not rule it out. So yes, there are strong elements in that. We have to basically, in that context, we have to see how we handle Pakistan. So there is another thought process that eventually Pakistan would explode. If Pakistan would explode, then whether that would be in India's interest. The pro of it is that it will not be a strong unified Pakistan, but the dark side of it would be there would be chaos. We do not know what would happen to nuclear weapons. And this may turn Pakistan into Afghanistan. There are already strong forces who are working within Pakistan and outside Pakistan to turn Pakistan into Taliban Pakistan. So whether we want Taliban Pakistan or not, whether we want another Afghanistan on our border or not. So we need to have a serious debate on that, and with a very long-term perspective, we have to work in that particular direction. Liberal thought in a liberal school, it has been advocating for long that we should engage Pakistan very strongly. And by engaging Pakistan, we should create within Pakistan very strong groups that can then in turn create pressure on Pakistani establishment to normalize relations with India or to keep the Kashmir issue on the back burner also. So that is also quite a good thought process, that if we have hundreds and thousands of people within Pakistan whose economic interests are linked to India, that certainly would be a pressure on Pakistani government. Why is it that after so much of hostility with China, we have not been able to decrease our trade with China? Because there are certainly economic interests that are involved on the Indian side as well, which would be hampered if we decrease our trade with China also. So it's a deterrence on Indian government. Similarly, there are deterrents on Chinese government also, that if India would take very radical steps, then it would go against Chinese economic interest, and that also would work on Chinese government. So whether such kind of arrangement, the interdependency theory, whether it could work between India and Pakistan, we have not explored it seriously at no point of time. For us, intelligence and policy making vis-a-vis Pakistan is very flimsy, in a James Bond style, we think of it also. But intelligence in foreign policy is actually about thinking 25 years, 30 years afterwards. Now, vis-a-vis China, US intelligence has failed. What US thought 40 years ago, that China would become like US, China would become democratic, one party rule would go away, etc. They have failed, but at least they had a strategy in mind. They worked on that if they would engage China strongly, then China would become liberal, China would become part of the world order also. But much to their dismay, what has happened is that China now has emerged economically more powerful than what they envisaged. And those complicities now has created new tensions between US and China also. But at least I would give credit that long-term strategy and policy and implementation, it was there vis-a-vis engaging China also.
Yeah. Okay. Parimal, your lecture was really insightful. And these 3Ds, they actually raised the question. This is 3D theory. This question is about the development mostly. When we talk about decolonization, when we talk about denuclearization, we are coming to the development. And whatever, in all over the world, we talked against destructive development. And that phenomenon was world level. And that was also affecting on foreign policies. And what type of effects from like world level, where like World Bank or like globalization like IMF, all these, and in the same way in India. So how we can see, because when we are talking about security, we are talking about nuclear, means no weapons or denuclearization. Simultaneously, we can see the security problem, but there is no security on the borders. There is no security for the women all over the world. There is no security in mostly the people who are living in those countries. So the all values which we were talking about, equity, equality, fraternity, secularism, and liberty, all are endangered all over the world. So how then we are seeing the alternative development phenomenon and such type of movements have actually given impact on foreign policies?
I'm really not sure how exactly they are impacting the foreign policies. I would say these movements, they are at a very nascent stage at this point of time. But they have the potential to emerge very strongly in different parts of the world. This is what the neo-Marxists in international relations, they do believe, that there are certain common threads that we could see across the world. And if all of them could come together, if all of them can join hands, and through these forces, if we could channelize an alternative model, it can become fruitful. So we had the movements against WTO, particularly on the agricultural issues worldwide also. We had Arab Spring for democracy in West Asia. We had the Wall Street movement that spread very rapidly across US, Europe, and then other capitals in the world also. We do have the LGBTQI movement across the world, something that was not in existence in many parts of the world, but it is there today. So these are the common threads that are emerging all over the world. And again, something that is binding it all together is the issue of climate change. That all these groups and all these movements, they are extremely conscious about climate change. Climate change is one of the important glues for all these movements also. So these are the positive things that are happening. There are also some negative things, but which are very forceful, through which an alternative models can emerge. At least two of them are, one is the refugee problem in the world. If we look at number of political refugees in the world, political refugees in a sense, refugees who have been affected by violence, they have increased post 1991. The number has not been, it has not decreased. And the number of migrants in the world. So the documented migrants, official migrants, undocumented migrants, unofficial migrants, but who have gone to different countries for work. That number has also increased phenomenally. Now this issue of refugees and issue of migrants, they are directly challenging the notion of nation states. They are asking all the countries to revisit the notion of nation state, to revisit the Westphalian regime. And they have a very strong potential to make a dent to the Westphalian regime. I personally believe so. So the movements which are on the positive side, and then the issue of refugees and issue of migrants, all together, if we view it together, and if we could come out with a theoretical framework of it which could be adopted everywhere, but something that must look beyond the nation states now. What is happening currently, including for the issue of climate change, we are trying to find out solution to the global issues without doing away with the nation state system or the Westphalian state system. The issue of terrorism also is a global issue. So all these problems, issues, movements, so they no longer can remain limited to the four walls of the national borders, and therefore there is a strong requirement of a concrete framework that could take all these factors together and try to see a world beyond the Westphalia. Yes.
So that was the last question.
I would like to thank Dr. Harshad for an insightful presidential address, and of course Dr. Parimal for a wonderful time-bound and perfectly packed speech. Such a vast subject, and it was very well presented. The challenges, dilemmas, and introspection were rightly said in a very short points. As you rightly said, that vibrant dialogues and think tanks are missing, and thank you for appreciating YCC's initiative in this. And I think we would, in fact, Tai herself had said that we want to take these dialogues to, pan Maharashtra, because we are working at grassroots levels, pan Maharashtra and all the 36 districts. And we would be taking these dialogues at those spaces, as we know that our aspirations are our possibilities. And if we have such dialogues and think tanks, the aspirations reach us. And I think that would be a great platform. And this is our 7th session. And we would also like the speakers who have been involved with us till now to be a part of the future sessions too, and many more to come. So YCC has touched various subjects, right from cybersecurity to environment, Indochina, Russia, Ukraine, to the aspirational foreign policy. And we will be covering many more important subjects. This is being a year-long program that we are running. I would like to reinstate the YCC vision here, that creating equal opportunities for all for a prosperous society. So we would like to thank all of you for your continuous support to YCC. I would like to thank my team, Sanjana, who is our call center. She's right there sitting back. I'm sure you must have received calls from her and all our student volunteers who continuously keep calling and updating you with our programs. Our education head, the team of Nehru Center here, and please follow our website for the next sessions that will be coming. So our website, Savan Center at and please do give your critical feedbacks on education at savancenter.org. The sessions will be updated over there on a regular basis. And right now we will end the session with National Anthem. So thank you everyone for being here, and special thanks to Tai for attending the entire session till the end. Thank you.
Janana